Hey folks, welcome back. So I've been looking a lot at various incarnations of the Cypher System recently, namely Numenera and the Strange. And you can see actually at one point in the core rulebook for the Strange, they allude to the forthcoming Cypher System generic version of the system. Because clearly once they made the Strange and realized you could build basically any world you want really simply using the system, they thought, why not make a generic version? And so they did. And so that's what we're going to look at over the next few videos. We're going to take a quick look at the core rulebook today, and it will actually be fairly quick because a lot of this will be stuff that you already know. So I'll just cover like what is new in this generic rulebook. You will see some repeats of monsters from bestiaries from the other systems, for example, so we'll skip over a lot of stuff. But what we will look at in more detail later will be the genre sourcebooks. So I've got a few of these. I've got Claim the Sky, so this is a separate supplement about all about how to run superhero games in the Cypher System. It's very, very cool. I also have Stay Alive, which is about running all kinds of different genres of horror games in Cypher. They're all nice, thick, 224-page volumes, all beautifully bound, as is the Monte Cook Games tradition by now. And then I have We Are All Mad Here by the fantastic Shanna Germain, which is really interesting. It's a fairy tale, how to run fairy tale based games, but also it's kind of focusing on mental health aspects in a really kind of sensitive and interesting way. And you can see the book has a really nice visual style to it. You know, it gives you that sort of fairy tale vibe. Each supplement has its own kind of vibe that they've given to it visually, which is very cool. So we'll look at those in detail one by one. But for now, I'm going to shove those to the side. Just to get your sort of taste buds ready for that further down the line, and we'll look at the Cypher System core rulebook. This is the second version, basically. It's not really changed from the initial one. It's been revised and updated and enhanced. So my understanding is that the first version, the cover was totally different. It was quite a bit thinner, but still pretty chunky. And then they released a supplement called Expanded Worlds, which had some more ideas for how to use the Cypher System for certain genres of gaming. And they've folded some of those into this book now. So it's a little bit confusing. You might think, oh, I should get Expanded Worlds, but a lot of that stuff, I believe, is now in here already. So don't worry about that. I would think more about getting the generic rule book, getting your hands your mind around the basics, and then focus in on the genre books that really fit your taste if you want to go down a specific route. Or if you're going to do something like The Strange, where you're going all different universes, then, just do it however you want. But yeah, got a great set of end papers here with a woman giving an offering to some terrifying dragon thing with lots of interesting ornamentation. And we'll see quickly in the table of contents. So there's quite a lot of stuff in here. We've got the basics of the Cypher System, a lot on character creation. In fact, all the way up to page 204. And then we have the rules, which is actually comparatively much shorter, only up to page 237. And then we have information on the different genres and advice on how to run those kind of games. And then advice for game masters, which includes creature listings, some NPCs, sample ciphers, and advice on running the system in general. And then at the back, there's a useful campaign design worksheet, and of course a general character sheet. And I will, in the meantime, shed a bit of light on the subject here. Just tone it down a little bit. There we go. You can see, as usual, the quality of the pages, the illustrations, everything is really great. And I would really back up this statement here, where you think this book is a chest of toys. You can pull out whatever you want and play with it however you want. I mean, they give you this amazing toolbox. And the Cypher System itself is really probably the most GM-friendly system ever. I mean, you basically just have to be able to set a difficulty from 1 to 10, tell that to the player, and then they try to find ways to reduce it or use an asset to reduce it or whatever. And then you work out the target number and they roll, just a regular D20. And if they beat the target number, which is based on the difficulty times 3, then they win. Otherwise, no. And if you're in combat, you roll a 19 or a 20, you can have special effects and stuff like that. There's a lot more to it than that, of course. There's you can apply effort and skills and all that, but that's the core of it. And as a GM, I mean, it allows you to make up so many things on the spot with minimal effort, but it still feels meaningful because along with just coming up with that base difficulty level to interact with that object or creature or whatever. You can give them special traits. You can give them weapons that do certain different things. You can give them modifications to their level for certain aspects of their behavior, etc. So all the stuff in the basics here is stuff that we already know from our looks at Numenera and so on. In the character building section, again, it's the same core that we're familiar with. So you have your core 3 stats of might, speed, and intellect, which run as pools. As you use aspects of your pool or they get damaged, then you will start to have more difficulty basically using those particular aspects of yourself. But you do have edges as well, which will reduce the cost of pool spends for different things. And you can expend effort basically to reduce or ease a task by 1 step. So it tells you how to go through that. And you can apply further effort to ease the task even further, but it costs additional points from the stat pool. So if you really, really need to win a difficult task, there are many ways to go about doing it, but all of them come with a cost, of course. Then they give you, of course, many examples, the usual helpful side notes on, the ways to use all these different aspects of the system. They never leave the GM or the player short of advice in these books, which I just love. They talk about the character tier system, which is different from the standard kind of class and level idea of other systems. And of course, the open-ended skill system. So there's no defined list of skills. They can be whatever you want. But, they basically limit how many of them can be super generic. So you can't have a whole list of like, I'm really good with everything to do with physics. It has to be more specific things most of the time to be more realistic. The characters are generated the same way as in the games we're familiar with. So there are 4 character types in the game: warriors, adepts, explorers, and speakers. Those are the 4 basic types. And it boils down to I am an adjective, noun, who, verbs. So you have your descriptor, your type, and your focus, basically. Then they go through the different types. So you have the warrior and examples of how they apply to the provided genres, which is great. So a warrior in fantasy could be a fighter, swordsman, knight, barbarian, whatever. In modern or horror romance, they might be a police officer, soldier, watchman, detective. In sci-fi, they might be a security officer or a trooper. In superhero or post-apocalyptic, they'll be kind of a hero or a big brick like the Hulk or something, or a bruiser type, basically. Then it gives you your starting stat pools, your first tier abilities, gives you a table to roll on your background connection, which is how you're connected to the setting. And then it gives you so the skills in this game, or in this rulebook rather, are written out as just lists with page references. And then there's one giant chapter that kind of tells you what all the different abilities do. So it compactifies the character creation chapters quite a bit. So at first I was kind of annoyed because I don't like to flip around too much in the book, but in practical terms, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you don't need to reference these too often. You can write a note to yourself on your character sheet, what each type does as you move up a tier, for example. And it does make the character explanations of the different types much, much more compact, which I like a lot. You could be an adept, so that's kind of your wizard types. Wizards, witches, psionists, telepaths, the sorcerer supreme, that kind of stuff, depending on your setting. And we get through their abilities and gains at different tiers, all the way up through 1 through 6. We have some example adepts as well. And we have the explorers. They are kind of the adventurers, the dungeon delvers, the investigative reporters, the planetary specialists or xenobiologists, people that love exploring and finding things out, which can work in any setting as well. Once again, we go through their basic stat pools, then their 1st through 6th tier abilities. Then we have an example with an explorer character for a science fiction campaign. And there he is, I guess. Or maybe, no, that's a speaker, sorry. The speaker is kind of your bard type character or diplomat. In science fiction, they might be like a diplomat or an empath like Counselor Troy, or a manipulator like a Bene Gesserit in Dune. that kind of. They use their influence in words and trickery. So their trickery and guile are their main things. They're support characters. They manage other characters, and they use charisma to further their own agenda, basically. So then there's some examples, some possibilities for customization, the drawbacks and penalties of the type, etc. Then we get a chapter on adding flavor, which are groups of special abilities the GMs and players can use to alter a character type to make it more or less what they're looking for in a given setting. So they're basically alternate options for flavoring a type, depending on what kind of setting you want to be in. So if you want to add a stealth flavor, it gives you some examples of stealth flavor abilities you can grab from the abilities chapter that would help give a character type that flavor. If you want to give a high-tech flavor, like to the Adept class, for example, you want to make or a new type that's maybe, Netrunner style type of thing. Here's some abilities that apply to that. So it's really great. They give you these, off the shelf, like, okay, you want a magic character, here's some ways to make them more magical, basically. You want a heavy combat flavored warrior, here you go. You want skills, knowledge, this really helps you in your campaign design and can also be done collaboratively with your players. Then we have the list of descriptors, which is huge. So I'm not going to go through all these. There's just too many. It's more fun to discover them in the book yourself. There really are loads of them. So you have a huge number of possible characters, as per normal with the Cypher system. And then we get to the focus. So that's the last part of your character sentence. I'm an adjective, noun, who, verbs. This is the verb part. And then you can also choose focus connections. So this basically links you in some other way to another PC in terms of your focus. Could be that, they're completely immune to your focus for some reason, or, you were once hired to track down that person for some reason. It just adds a little spice to the party, basically, gives some backstory. There's loads of options to roll on the table there. It gives you some tips on adding a story behind the focus, and then it gives you the foci themselves and what basic abilities you get at each tier, essentially. So the full description for each focus ability is found in the chapter 9. So chapter 9 is just all the descriptions of all of this. But yeah, again, there are loads of foci in here, and each genre book adds more for that particular genre. But there's loads of cool stuff in here, like loves the void, so you love being in space. So that's a perfect. Sci-fi one, for example, is wanted by the law, could apply to loads of different settings, would be great in like a Wild West kind of thing. Is licensed to carry, you're being a good gunner, that kind of stuff. Mastering spells, so you're really good at magic. You could be a stealther, moving like a cat, moves like the wind, so you're very swift. You murder, so you're an assassin, perhaps. Already you can see, just by looking through these and combining with the types, you can make an enormous variety of different characters. And that's just based, again, on the core. Then there's, of course, the ability to create new foci as well. You want to choose abilities by their relative power, try and keep things relatively balanced and make sure that they fit a concept. And then think about the kind of things that can go wrong. So that the GM intrusions can have some impact as well when focus abilities are being used. Then there are different kind of focus categories. So ones that provide NPC followers are called ally use foci. You have ability selection guidelines for those. They're basic foci. Energy manipulation, environment manipulation. So these are all giving you ideas on how to construct, different types of foci that have a certain flavor to them. It gives you guidelines for selecting abilities at each tier to kind of fit that vibe. So it's very, very cool. It's as a generic rulebook system. I mean, they've really put this together fantastically well. I don't know how the first version was. I've never seen it, but I've heard that in general, this is considered a big improvement over the first version. And of course, the layout, as usual, is pretty much flawless. There's nothing I can really compare negatively to it. So now in chapter 9, we get a list of all the actual abilities. For example, cures damage, aids or improves recovery rolls, or negates, cures, suspends, or otherwise gives immunity to a harmful condition, such as poison, disease, mental attacks, moving down on the damage track, or dying. And then, it shows you which low, mid, and high tier powers fall into that category. And again, gives you a rules reference page so you can see what that particular ability actually does. So they really, they categorize everything. They give you hot tips on everything. And then now we get into the actual kind of rules text of each. If something says enabler, basically, that means that skill is on all the time. Otherwise, it's something that you activate during a specific task or during a certain situation. But if it's an enabler, then it's always used. So here it says, you can bear 4 ciphers at a time, and that's always on. So that can be a big help for that character. Some of them say action, so you have to use an action if you're in a combat situation to use that. But the rules are really always pretty easy to apply, even if the text looks challenging. I mean, here for assume control, you have to spend 6 or more intellect points. You control the action of another creature you have interacted with or studied for at least a round. This effect lasts for 10 minutes. The targets must be level 2 or lower. Once you've assumed control, the target acts as if it wants to accomplish your desire to the best of its ability. Blah, blah, blah. You can choose to use effort to increase the maximum level of your target. Thus, to command a level 5 target, 3 levels above the norm, you must apply 3 levels of effort. And then, it tells you when the effect ends, the target remembers everything that happened and reacts according to its nature and your relationship with it. So if it doesn't like you and you make it do something really helpful to you and bad for them, they will respond accordingly. And it takes an action to initiate. So, it's a lot of text, but it's just giving you all the options that you need. The rules themselves are really simple to understand. Level 2 or lower, apply effort for the number to be higher. That's it. And most of the abilities work in that sort of way. Again, I'm going to skip over most of these because there are hundreds of them. We can just go through so many abilities. I think we go all the blue colored pages here is abilities, like all the way through the alphabet. You've got stuff like predictive model, 2+ intellect points. If you use predictive equation on a creature, object, or location within the last few days, you can learn 1 random fact about the subject that is pertinent to a topic you designate. So, you can get all kinds of crazy abilities in here that apply to all sorts of different genres, which makes sense because it is a generic system. They want to make it as flexible as possible. But yeah, if you can't come up with a good character concept from these ingredients, I don't know what to tell you because it's really astoundingly comprehensive. Weird Science Breakthrough, that's a great image for that. I love that guy. Then finally we get into equipment. So it gives you some ideas about how to deal with currency. Some GMs like to track stuff, some GMs don't. So, you might use currency as a kind of element of flavor, or you might, want to keep track of your credits or something like that. They give price categories to items. So basically, an inexpensive thing is something that pretty much everybody can buy. Moderately priced item is something that common people can buy, but not often. An expensive item is something that would strain a common person's finances. A very expensive item is probably out of the reach of most people, except in very special circumstances. So stuff like jewelry or expensive furnishings. An exorbitant item is a luxury. A spaceship, a nice house, expensive jewelry or art, whatever. It tells you how to use the categories. It tells you how armor works in the game and how using armor affects your speed, effort, costs. It tells you about the 3 different categories of weapons. So light, medium, and heavy, with light doing little damage but also easing the difficulty of the attack. It tells you about explosive weapons, what ciphers and artifacts do, and that's it. Really, you don't need too many rules to use equipment in the game. The actual rules of the game, as I said, are only about a little over 30 pages. The basic 5 elements here that are right at the beginning, that's basically how to do anything. So the player tells the GM what they want to do. That's character action. 2, the GM determines if that action is routine and therefore works without needing a roll, or if there's a chance of failure. If there's a chance of failure, the GM determines what stat the task uses, might, speed, or intellect, and the task difficulty, how hard it will be on a scale from 1 to 10. The player and GM determine if anything about the character, such as training, equipment, special abilities, or various actions, can modify the difficulty up or down by 1 or more steps. If these modifications reduce the difficulty to less than 1, the action is routine and therefore works with no roll needed. If the action still isn't routine, the GM uses the difficulty to determine the target number, which is how high you must roll in the d20 to succeed at the action. And then you just multiply difficulty by 3. The player rolls a d20. If they roll equal to or higher than the target number, they succeed. That's it. That's the entire system, basically. They give you some key concepts here for the additional kind of wrinkles that come into it, but that's why I say it's so GM friendly. I mean, you can adjudicate anything that you can imagine, basically, with these 6 steps. And then all the rest of the book is giving you cool stuff to do within that framework and giving you ideas about how to use it. So I love the fact that the system is so light, but it's still filled with crunch in the sense that, the basic rule and task resolution is you can learn it in 5 seconds, but there's still loads of choices you can have in the game. There are interesting effects that can happen when you use your abilities. You can have special results from rolls. You can have GM intrusions that complicate things. You can have minor effects that help you or hinder you. You can have major effects that massively change what's happening in the current situation. There's all different kinds of actions you can do. It gives you a list of actions and the sort of time level they would take. Then it tells you about combat, attacking, damage, armor's effects on reducing damage, ambient damage, which is damage that comes from the environment. So it could be like, super cold winter temperatures, background radiation, stuff like that. And they have examples of hazard damage, which would be environmental damage, like, there's a fire on the ground or a bath full of acid or something weird like that. Then there's the effects of taking damage and going down the damage track. So you can go from hale and hardy to impaired. So every level of effort costs an extra point. You don't get minor and major effects on your rolls, and they don't deal as much extra damage on a special roll. Debilitated means you're critically injured. You can't take any other actions other than to move, probably crawl, no more than an immediate distance. If your speed pool is also 0, you can't move at all. And if you take enough damage to reduce the stat pool to 0, then you are dead. And dead is dead. There can be ways to bring people back, depending on the setting, of course, and the rules of your particular game. But dead is dead. Then there are ways of recovering your pool points, restoring yourself up and down, up the damage track, dealing with special damage, which can give conditions. So being dazed or stunned, poisoned or diseased, paralyzed, etc. How to deal with that with NPCs. Attack modifiers like covering, position, surprise, the effects of range and light levels, visibility, being underwater, gravity levels, whether targets are moving or not, area attacks, how to deal with attacking objects, blah, blah, blah. Everything you can imagine. So there's always enough to do in a combat that even though the basis is very simple, I've never found it to be boring. You can be creative with your assets and your abilities. And, combat in Cypher usually want to be something's happening besides just fighting. You're not just in a dungeon room like in D&D, with the fighter, stuck next to things and hitting them with a sword every turn. You're running over a crumbling surface while hunter-killer bots are chasing you. Things are falling around you. The environment's changing. Traits are being, added to the environment to make it tougher. There's hazards everywhere. You got to think about your movement. You got to think about teamwork, using your abilities. That is Cypher combat system at its best. To think action movie stuff. And then you can really come up with some cool ideas. Then we got a crafting system. We've got riding and piloting, sneaking around, swimming, vehicular combat and vehicular movement, which can include anything from, speeders and bikes to spaceships. GM instigated insights. So basically you can spend 2 XP if the GM tells you that you might be able to get some extra info here. There's also an optional rule for getting an XP advance. Then you can gain followers as well as you gain in tiers in your character. So there's some recommendations here on how to breathe your life into your followers. Like, don't just make them faceless pools of stats. Give them some personality, some vibe. And then there are some guidelines for GMs on how to dole out XP, depending on what happens in the story. You don't get XP from beating up monsters in these games. I mean, it's really got to be kind of advancing the storyline or doing something meaningful. There are some more optional rules. You can use minis if you want. I don't think it's worthwhile, but you can if you want to do that. Then there's a whole chapter on using XP, which, as I've mentioned before, in these Cypher System games is not like standard XP. They can be used for immediate benefits, short and medium-term benefits, and long-term benefits, which are like building up your character kind of stuff and character advancement stuff. Tiers aren't entirely like levels in other role-playing games. Gaining tiers is not the player's only goal or the only measure of achievement. And the assumption is that starting tier character is already pretty damn competent. This is a more heroic system. You're not kind of a normal person at the beginning. You already have special abilities. You're already trained in certain things. You know, it's cool. You're a person destined for something cool to happen. Then we have examples here of character arcs, and how they would open. Steps to take to go along that character arc, things that get in the way, the climax moment, and the resolution. And these character arcs, of course, can then be used to kind of benchmark when you want to give out GM and XP points and character advancement stuff. And again, there's loads of examples here. Then the genre section. This is really great stuff. Each section is pretty short, but it gives you enough to get started on creating a setting in that genre. And then if you buy the genre books as well, you're well on your way. So for fantasy, they give you suggested types and flavoring them with the chapter on flavor abilities to make sure it has a more magical feel. Ideas for suggested foci, suggested creatures and NPCs, other creatures and NPCs that with some basic stats for them, fantasy equipment that you might use, all the way up through exorbitant items, then some fantasy artifacts that your characters might find, and then how to mix up fantasy and science fiction, which is like Swords and Planet stuff, like on John Carter John Carter in the 2D20 system, or Numenera, science fantasy kind of stuff. You can have additional species available that have their own descriptors. You can have optional rules for spellcasting to make things a little more interesting. You can have some more spells available in these settings. Then we get to modern campaigns. So, you don't have to create a new world, which is an advantage if you're using like a real world place like London or, Manchester or whatever. Then it gives you some ideas for suggested types to use in a modern game and how to flavor them. So, police officer would be an explorer with combat flavor. Detective would be an explorer with stealth flavor. All this kind of useful stuff. So again, suggested foci, creatures, some additional creatures as well with basic stats, and a list of modern equipment, all the way up to very expensive and exorbitant stuff. Modern artifacts is kind of not really something we do in the real world, so we don't really have artifacts as such, but maybe, they could be special super high-tech prototype stuff that, in a Mission Impossible type game or something, but in most cases, you're not going to use it that much. But they do have some tips for doing modern fantasy games. One of the newest Kickstarter for Cypher that was actually run on BackerKit, sorry, not Kickstarter. They have another background book called, I think it's just Magic, which is basically expanding the urban fantasy idea into a whole book. So that should be great. You can also have childhood adventures if you want to do like Stranger Things type stuff. And then it has some hot tips on handling PCs as kids, because that can be challenging. And childhood adventure threats. Crime and espionage games. The kind of challenges you might encounter when doing tradecraft, working as a spy. Then we get into sci-fi. So again, as with the other genres, we've got suggested types. We're adding technology mostly, and skills and knowledge flavor, except for the psychic knight or the scion, who would just be an adept or a warrior with a magic flavor. They got tips on creating a setting, running the game, suggested foci creatures and some additional creatures, additional equipment for sci-fi games, which gets you cool stuff like stun sticks and blasters, environment suits, pulse laser guns, battle suits, gravity regulators, jetpacks, pretty awesome stuff. Science fiction artifacts could be basically relics from an unknown civilization or an alien civilization. So mind imagers, psychic crystals, weird stuff that is science-y, but you still don't quite understand it. There's some sample starship types as well. That's actually a repeated picture from one of the Strange books. I think that's the Starship Resolution from the World's Many and Strange book. It has tips as well for hard sci-fi. So this is stuff more like The Expanse, where things like actual physics kind of come into play. You've got to worry about acceleration, deceleration. You can also talk about the rise of AI, which is a popular theme in sort of near future sci-fi, all the way up to like singularity level stuff like Accelerando by Charles Stross. You also need to concern yourself with the effects of gravity and microgravity, long-term exposure to these environments, some estimated times for interplanetary travel if you're using a plasma engine. Orbital mechanics as well if you're dealing with solar systems. Some hard science fiction threats that you might encounter. These could be, solar flares, space debris, AI malfunction, diplomatic problems, micrometeorites piercing your ship, all sorts of stuff. And you could also mix science fiction and modern and do a kind of X-Files type thing. So loads of cool ideas in this chapter. And the sci-fi genre book is called, I think, The Stars Are Fire for Cypher. And I have yet to find anywhere that has a copy of it. I think it must be very, very popular. So I'm very much looking for that for my collection as well. I may have to just buy it direct from Monte Cook. Then we got another great section on horror. So creating a good horror atmosphere and setting, making sure to get consent. It's very important for a horror game. You never want to properly basically terrorize your players. You want them to be scared but not traumatized. So make sure that there's content that that you plan to put in your game that is tolerable for everybody, that will scare them but not make them feel actively traumatized and horrible. Then we have ideas for creatures and NPCs. Some horror artifacts, which could be stuff like, the Necronomicon or mysterious shadow box. That makes me think of the puzzle box from Hellraiser, that sort of stuff. You can have optional additional rules, so shock. When a PC encounters something horrific, disgusting, dreadful, impossible, or otherwise shocking, call for an intellect defense roll based on the level of the creature involved, or simply an appropriate level as decided by the GM. Failure might mean that for one round the player loses control, and that usually means the character runs, screams, gibbers, stares slack-jawed, or just does nothing. However, the player should welcome player input into the situation. The point is to portray that we're shocked. We don't always react in the best way, the smartest way, or even the way we want to. Alternatively, you could also have the failure on the intellect defense just mean intellect damage equal to the level of the event. And here's some example shock levels for things that could occur in a horror game. So stuff like a jump scare, a loud noise, unexpectedly seeing a corpse, watching someone die, watching a friend die, seeing a monster, seeing something mind-bending like an impossible multi-dimensional demigod coalescing out of thin air. Then you have horror mode as well, which is kind of an escalation rule. So basically, things begin as normal, but as you get to the haunted house, or the killer gets closer, or the elder things summoned by the cultists are awakened, things change, and the game goes into horror mode. Basically, the rules for GM intrusions are changed so that it becomes a roll of not just one gets a GM intrusion, but a roll of 1 or 2. Then, as time passes, the escalation or the intrusion range gets bigger and bigger. So it'll become 1 to 3, then 1 to 4, and so on. So it's more and more likely that something will go wrong, and a GM intrusion will bust in, either costing you XP spends or escalating the danger for the players. So that's a really cool optional rule for the climactic moments of a horror game. And it gives you some ideas for the escalation rate as well, depending on the activities of the players. There's also tips on using GM intrusions for horror, an optional rule for madness. So basically, if you... when PCs encounter something shocking, they always take intellect damage. If they would normally move one step down the damage track, they instead immediately regain points equal to 1d6 plus their tier in their intellect pools, but lose 1 point from their maximum in the pool. And characters whose intellect pools reach 0 go insane. They lose their current descriptor and adopt the mad descriptor, regain 1d6 plus tier points to their intellect pools, and gain +1 to their intellect edge. If they ever reach a permanent intellect pool maximum of 0, they go stark raving mad and are no longer playable. So it's a Cypher adaptation of the sanity system, the slow downward spiral of madness of Call of Cthulhu, which I just love. Of course, you can mix horror and sci-fi. Famously, Alien does that really well. There's a nice example of that here in this image. Cypher can do it just as well. They've got romance. Not really my thing, but it's cool that it's possible in the system. Again, you want to check in with your players, get consent and boundaries. If you want to do courtly romance, or whether you want to do full-on, hotness like you might get in a climactic episode of Bridgerton or something. Always check in with your players, make sure that, everything's cool with them. And there's an optional rule for infatuation. So if your player is near someone they're infatuated with, then they have to roll an intellect defense, basically. And if they fail, they might do something or say something embarrassing or awkward. And if that happens, it might cause the player to do something even worse to kind of detract from it or to cover it up, So it simulates the kind of that sort of red-cheeked embarrassment you get when you're near the potential suitor or your wanted lover. There's also an optional rule for relationship levels from 1 to 10. So 1 is like, first meeting, you're kind of interested or curious about them. Level 4 is serious affection. 5, we're at love confession time. At 8, we're at soulmates. And at 10, it's a bond that transcends time and space. So pretty serious love bond there. They also have platonic relationship levels as well. So it doesn't have to be just love relationships. Then we get into superheroes. So this gets really interesting as well because, you need to be able to represent the ability of superheroes to achieve far beyond normal people. So it gives you an idea of suggested types, foci, and all that kind of stuff. But then basically you need to tailor the system a little bit more. So, the abilities that you get from the standard foci might not be enough. So you might want to modify those to make them more powerful. And the optional rule here, which is expanded on in the Claim the Sky genre book, is the idea of power shifts. So this is basically that, rather than kind of bumping up, the simple might, speed, or intellect pools of a character to represent how tough they are as a superhero, instead you use power shifts. So under this rule, all superhero characters get 5 power shifts. They're like permanent levels of effort that are always active. So you can use them on, the ease tasks that fall into categories, which include but are not limited to things like accuracy. So that'd be all attack rolls, dexterity, movement, acrobatics, etc., healing, intelligence, power, resilience, strength. So you could dump 3 power shifts into strength, and then you have 3 automatic points of effort to every roll involving your strength, which could be jumping, throwing things, jumping over things, all that kind of stuff. And because you have this power shift thing, you also have to alter the difficulty cap. So the difficulty cap of the normal game is 10, but in a superheroic game, difficulty cap's at 15 instead. So each difficulty above 10 is like one more step beyond the impossible. And in theory, NPCs in such a game can go up to level 15 as well. Levels above 10 can represent opponents that only a superhero would consider taking on, like a robot that's 1,000 feet tall, level 11, Galashal, Empress of 12 Dimensions, level 14, or a space monster the size of the moon, level 15. So yeah, it's really cool that they give you these interesting new mechanics to represent the much higher power levels of a superhero game. They give you some artifact examples, which, those are very easy to get ideas for in the superhero literature, shall we say, the comic books. But the Claim the Sky rulebook is full of great ideas to expand on that, so we will look at that at some point. Then we have the post-apocalyptic games, and they're doing a whole additional setting book on this as well, with the latest backer kit campaign, so I'm looking forward to that too. So again, hot tips on creating different kinds of apocalypses could be, a zombie plague, an alien invasion, meteor strike, AI uprising, whatever. Then you want to come up with some threats in the wastelands, the uninhabitable parts of your apocalyptic world, ways to customize your post-apocalyptic aftermath, and then how to basically deal with scavenging, which your players will have to do to survive because normal civilization has collapsed. So this will give you some ideas on how to adjudicate that sort of stuff. And here's some tables of useful stuff or some junk that you might find when out scavenging. Some suggested types. and foci, and then some additional equipment. These are kind of pretty basic items in a sense, but could be very useful depending on the situation, like radiation pills. So they help you suffer, radiation effects for 12 hours. Post-apocalyptic artifacts could be, artifacts of technology from before whatever the disaster was that still works somehow. So there's a few examples of that. And then you could have like some additional species. So they offer the example of the Morlocks, who have been living underground, or an evolved species of cockroach, which is a pretty funny idea for a kind of post-nuclear apocalypse. And then we have fairy tales, which, as I mentioned, are covered in the We're All Mad Here genre book as well, in much more detail. So they give you some ideas and sources to think about for your fairy tale game. Use lots of descriptive language. Try and keep things fresh. Don't use like fairy tales people already know. Try to keep that flavor, but branch it off in a new way. And to really use the nature of fairy in fairy tales, like, things can develop out of nowhere. Fey creatures can play tricks on you. Colorful, interesting things happen. And there's this wonderful table of fairy tale wonders. So if you need something interesting to happen, roll on the table and get some fairy tale magic going. Pretty cool. And then some suggested fairy tale artifacts, suggested foci, some creatures, etc. But really, the book by Shauna Germain is highly recommended if you want to do a fairy tale game. I think it's an absolutely amazing supplement for that. You can do historical games, so like Old West, Cthulhu style 1920s, World War II, whatever. One of the draws of being in a historical game is the thrill of being there, so you want to be evocative, but you also want to feel like the players have some agency. So you can make things feel historical, but still give them the chance to change things up. Maybe they do assassinate Hitler or something. And then you can also use aspects of the tips for historical games in a time travel game, which could actually be a sci-fi game. So that's kind of an interesting combo as well. And of course, we have suggested types, foci, and everything else. So each genre section is really, really useful, despite being very short. More than enough to get you started, because there's so many ingredients in this book as it is. And then the ones that are expanded upon in the genre books, you've got more than enough to get you a solid campaign design that'll last for years. Okay, then we have the game mastering section of the book. So we've got a list of creatures. Some of these, as I say, we'll have seen elsewhere. So there's a few lists for normal animals. We've got the general abomination for the post-apocalypse setting. So, they could be zombies, they could be mutations, all that kind of stuff. We have the chimera, which is more of a fairy tale thing. We've seen them in one of the other bestiaries. The chronophage, they're drawn to time paradoxes and disruptions in space-time. So a problem potentially if you're in a sci-fi time travel situation. We have the crazer, which I believe we've seen perhaps in the strange bestiary. I can't remember. But yeah, they are machines built for destruction. We have the deep one, classic drawn from the copyright-free world of H.P. Lovecraft. We have the Deinonychus, known as the Velociraptor by most people, thanks to Jurassic Park, but what they were actually showing you was a Deinonychus. Velociraptors were actually really tiny. Then we have demigods. They could be level 9 monstrosities. Lesser gods, they could appear in mythical or kind of fantasy-based campaigns. We have demons and devils. Again, really good for magical worlds. Pretty fierce opponents. And they have a lot of different interesting abilities. So demons can possess you. Devils are more kind of foot soldiers that carry tridents, and they just love torturing and being malevolent using fear. You have the genie, if you want to do a fairy tale kind of thing with a bit of an Arabian flavor. You've got dragons for your classical mythical fantasy beast. You got the various types of elementals, fire, earth. We've got the enthraller, which is a kind of alien psychic domination creature. Enthraller overlords are even more powerful. They can give a single enthraller governor the ability to dominate a small city, solar system sized ring relays that boost their control across interstellar distances, and more. So, a very dangerous opponent in a sci-fi game. They could enslave entire worlds psionically. You can have fallen angels. Again, interesting battle to be had in the fantasy-based campaign. The Fusion Hound, which we've definitely seen in Numenera, I believe. And the Ghost as well. Perfect for a horror campaign. The Ghoul, another good one for horror campaigns. The Giant, which can appear in a lot of different guises. Here is kind of a sci-fi version of a giant. So, that could be a gigantic robot or some kind of mecha or whatever. I mean, all of these can be flavored differently, of course, to use in your different campaigns. Then we got some giant rats, snakes, spiders, gross, and goblins. We've got animated golems. Again, very commonly seen in D&D and stuff like that. We have the Greys, which we saw in The Strange as well. We have Kaiju, so these are giant monsters, Godzilla style. Level 10, so, better be a superhero or tier 6 monster to take these on. Killer Clowns, here he's juggling a skull, a finger, and an eyeball. And splatters of blood everywhere, so definitely one for the horror GMs. We got Killing White Light. Not sure what that's all about. Yeah, so that seems like an eye-watering point of brilliance. Despite the blazing intensity, Killing White Light is as cold as starlight on a December night, sapping heat and life from living things. Okay, so that could fit into a number of campaigns. Mechanical Soldier, that could be like an alt history, World War II Nazi super project. Could be a sci-fi military trooper. You could flavor that in all kinds of different ways. We've got the Migo, the space-traveling fungoids, again from Lovecraft. They're very good at creating really messed up sci-fi kind of materials and objects. And they can put your brain into a brain cylinder, which is always a bad thing. We've got the Mokuren, which is drawn from Japanese mythology, I believe. So they're not so strong, but they are very deceptive. Then we have the Niveri and Nupepo, which we've seen in other bestiaries. We've got the Ogre and the Orc, which we've seen as well elsewhere. But I really love this illustration, I gotta say. The fantastic dynamism with the blood flying off the axe. Then we got the Princess of Summer, which sounds very much like a fairy tale storyline. Puppetry, again, that could be taken a number of different ways. Could be a kind of walking tree on an alien, creepy world. Could be some kind of tree spirit in a fairy tale game. All kinds of stuff. The Ravage Bear, that I believe is a Numenera creature, translated over. And they even give you suggestions, right? So Ravage Bears could be predators on an alien planet, hunters from an alternate dimension, mutants, or even Kodiak bears in modern settings. Then we have the Replicants. So these are, I love that illustration, by the way. You can see his kind of evil reflection. Basically, these are designed to look like humans, but are not humans, and can infiltrate groups of humans relatively easily to do nasty things. We can have dark elves, here called shadow elves. We can have your skeletons, here armed with AK-47s, it looks like. So, pretty scary, although they're only level 2, so not too bad. We have the Slitikin. So they could be the result of a magical curse, a demon possession by several entities at once, a transhuman experiment, a species of creatures driven insane after modifying themselves to speak with humans, or something else entirely. So there are these horrible multi-mouthed creatures here. We have animate statues, which I believe we also saw in Numenera as well. We have some supervillains for superhero campaigns. We've got Anathema, strength 7. So he hits foes with bone-shocking force and has a healing factor where he heals 10 points of health per round. We've got Dr. Dread, who's also at level 7. Can exist outside time or space, and can establish force fields, energy fields that give her extra armor, become invisible, and shoot plasma blasts. We've got level 8 Magnetar. We're getting into real serious threats here. He can add mass to his punch, and has a level 11 control over all metal within very long range. So it's kind of super Magneto. Then we have Mr. Genocide. Gotta love him. Level 5, but he can make a level 7 poison attack that affects up to 10 victims within short range as a single action. If you fail a might defense roll, you take 7 points of speed damage, ignoring armor, and spend a round helpless as you cough and gag. But it's just a short effect. Then we have Wrath, who is the head of an elite group of assassins. So she prefers a sword, but is very adept with a crossbow. She's great at stealth, attacks, and speed defense as level 8, normal level 6. We have the classic T-Rex, an always good opponent in almost any campaign, really. Level 7 monstrosity that can trample you, attack you with its bite, which it's very difficult to pull free, and they can cause fear via their roar. And then we have vampires, which are, of course, powerful undead, notoriously difficult to hurt. They can change form, they're strong, they're fast, and they have unholy charisma and can mesmerize you if you're in immediate distance. We have transitional vampires, which are people that have been bitten, but haven't quite got to full vampire level yet. We got Vat Rejects, so these are when cloning goes wrong. I think we saw that in the Strange as well. And we got War Droid with an excellent illustration. It's a very cool looking battle suit. So they are basically Star Troopers need heavy support. They bring in War Droids, and they can have a number of different possible abilities depending on a roll on the D6 table. You've got the Wendigo. Here it's eating the face off someone, which is horrible. They hunger for raw flesh, and a reek of decay and death betrays their approach. So, yeah, not great. Then we have the Werewolf, classic enemy for a horror campaign. We got Witches, which we've seen in the other bestiaries. We got the Xenoparasite, which is a new one. So an alien creature exists only to eat and reproduce. In doing so, it also destroys every form of life it encounters. So their motive is to eat and reproduce. They hunt alone or in small groups. They can fly. They have great stealth at level 8. And they can also have an ovipositor that inflicts 3 points of damage and injects thousands of eggs if you fail your might defense roll. An egg host requires the attention of someone skilled in medicine to sterilize all the eggs in the victim's blood before they hatch, which kills the host and releases 1d6 juvenile xenoparasites. So yeah, you can do alien using this book if you want. We got Jevs, which are robotic entities that serve as the peacekeeping force in technologically advanced cities. So basically they're giant sort of AI patrols, essentially. We've got the classic zombie. So fresh zombies are a little bit different. They are vulnerable to electricity. Some zombies are infectious, so they spread a level 8 disease that moves you 1 down the damage track each day if you fail a defense roll. And if you're killed by the disease, you become a zombie. Makes sense. They're also notoriously hard to finish off. If you kill them bring them down to 0 health, and the number you rolled was even, they die. Otherwise, they just have 1 health instead. So they can be dismembered, brutally damaged, and still keep walking. Then we got some useful NPCs for generic stuff. So assassins, crime bosses, detectives, guards, occultists, secret agents, thugs, and mighty wizards. Then a list of some ciphers. A new concept for the Cypher system is the subtle cipher. So these are a way to introduce ciphers into a game without like weird powers. So they can be, more subtle things like you have particularly good fortune. Sometimes you get, a eureka moment, inspiration. You have, advantages drawn from alien concepts, from encountering the unknown. You might have mysterious transmissions you can hear from some other reality. There are ways to have ciphers that doesn't kind of break immersion in the world you've created. But having ciphers is kind of pretty much part of the system, so it's recommended that you have them in some form, even if they are just subtle ones. And they talk about some suggestions and various tables to roll on to pick the different type of ciphers you might want, and then a list of various ciphers along with their type. They're either subtle, manifest, or fantastical. Again, there's loads and loads, and it's more fun to read them for yourself, so we'll just flip through all that. Then we have the important chapter for the GM, which is running the system. So this is dealing with task difficulties, how to deal with difficulties that are impossible and help players to kind of hit those points, not draw the game to a total halt. And don't get too worried about being precise, because, each level on the difficulty scale is 3 points on the final roll. So, we're not dealing with super granular systems here. You don't need to get hung up on, how close something is, get way into the weeds and arguing that kind of stuff. But you do want to be consistent. Sometimes you make a mistake, so you can walk it back by saying, oh, well, I wanted that door to be tougher for you to open, but it was already weakened by something, that sort of stuff. It gives you recommendations on when to make actions routine, how to judge difficulty on the fly, and the advantages of the Cypher system, which I think are pretty clear once you read the rules chapter. But and then some great tips on GM intrusion, and the use of GM intrusion as narrative tools, as a way of resolving situations, using and not abusing them. How to make them interesting when they occur through player roles, or having intrusions that affect the whole group, and then a whole list of possible intrusions that can result from different outcomes, and then player intrusions, and then just basic tips on dealing with everything else. Adjudicating things, running the game in a logical way, making dice rolling interesting, not just a constant activity that you do for the hell of it, but make it meaningful, and using your character types to help define the setting, tying actions to the right stats, allowing for interesting character abilities, but make sure that you challenge them as well. You can modify abilities on the fly for an optional rule. And then there's ideas on using ciphers and artifacts depending on the setting, dealing with character arcs and setting them up, handling NPCs, dealing with interactions with NPCs, and there are no intricate rules for languages, but they kind of think that you can either deal with that on a case-by-case basis if it's interesting to the story. If it's not interesting to the story, just assume that there's an impediment to interaction and you need to find a way around it. But generally just saying, oh, you can't speak to that creature at all because you don't share language A and language B is not that interesting. They think it's more interesting to either have some consequence to that, a reason for that to be the case, or just allow people to find a way to communicate somehow. Creatures in general should be handled like other NPCs. Some of them will have ways you can interact with them besides just immediately killing them. Then they give some tips on, teaching the rules, running the first few sessions, getting players used to it, running combats and making sure that the players feel like they have the agency, they have the choice, crafting good stories, crafting good pacing, making interesting encounters, as I was talking about before, good ways of describing the world depending on your choice of sort of genre tropes. And the Cypher system is designed for minimum prep, basically. There's not a lot of rules you need to know beforehand. Just kind of have a list of names that are appropriate to the setting if you need to make somebody up. Have an outline of where you think the story could go, but don't get too crazy with it because the characters always do stuff you don't expect. And then some interesting stuff about managing players themselves, which is unfortunately a problem at times. But it can be both ways, right? The player can be problematic for the GM, or you might be creating unfortunate problems for the players. So in either case, it gives you good tips on how to handle that. So also dealing with mature themes, consent, as well as we've seen in the horror chapter, for example. And then designing encounters. These are really great tips, by the way. Also check out, there's a good video about crafting encounters in Numenera, which I can link to in the description, which applies very well to anything in Cypher, I think. So I'll put the link in there for you. Sort of an idea about balancing encounters based on the level of the opponents versus the level of the characters. Then how to challenge characters through ongoing damage, lasting damage, permanent effects, getting rid of or harming equipment, enemies working together, beefing up the enemies with reinforcements or adding higher obstacles. And what happens when a character dies, which is often a big question. And then they have a lovely example of play to close things out, multi-pages. And finally, we have our index, which is nicely comprehensive enough. a campaign design worksheet. So what descriptors were available, what types are available, what are they based on, what's the general genre, and what modifications are you making to the types? Like, are you going to have an adept, but it's stealth focused, that kind of stuff. Then what descriptors you're going to allow, what foci you'll allow from the core book, and any other notes. And then there's the general character sheet, which is landscape format. But should look pretty familiar if you've seen Strange character sheets and Numenera as well. They look more kind of clean cut, but that's because they need to be for any kind of vibe. They don't want to give a specific vibe to the Cypher System sheet when it's a generic system. So you've got your tier, effort, and XP. You got your 3 pools. Your max pool, the current value, and the edge. You got your recovery rolls, your damage track, your skills, whether you're trained or specialized or incapable, special ability, ciphers, equipment, and attacks. And that's basically it. So yeah, that's the Cypher System core rulebook. It's really chunky. It's 448 pages. So it's a little more expensive than the core books for, say, Strange or Numenera, if you just buy one of the 2 Numenera books anyway. But it's totally worth it if you want to use Cypher to design a world of basically any type. And the genre books I have so far are absolutely fantastic, as you'll see in future reviews. When the new books come from the Kickstarter, I keep saying Kickstarter, but it's a backer campaign, which are It's Just Magic and the post-apocalyptic one. Of course, I will cover those. That pledge also will bring me a special limited edition version of this rulebook, which I will show off, but I won't make you go through the whole flip through again. But I will show it off because I'll be really happy to have that on the shelf as a collectible. So yeah, Cypher System. If you're into generic role-playing that is super GM friendly, then go for it. That's all I can say. And then until next time, I hope you enjoyed the review. Let me know in the comments what you think, and stay well, and I hope to see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.